Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our evening panel on the future of global history. I think what globalization means is pretty obvious at the moment. Repercussions of what is going on in the Middle East are perceptible at every gas station from Berlin to Beijing. And maybe also what happened yesterday, the Hungarian elections may have repercussions globally. We at least hope so. But I think this is not exactly what our panelists will be talking about tonight. The term globalization, the concept globalization, has had a significant rise in the 1990s for obvious reasons, I think. The end of the political divide between the two blocs, the ongoing process of decolonization, the neoliberal enthusiasm, the new information technologies, and so on and so forth. In the social sciences and the humanities, globalization almost replaced the term modernization that had become suspicious for also obvious reasons because of its teleological and Eurocentric biases. In the course of this, global history has become one of the most fruitful and also one of the most debated disciplinary approaches, even though, at least in Germany, I think it is still far from being mainstream that in the history departments you have a chair for global history. As Jürgen Osterhammer pointed out about 10 years ago in the Zeitschrift für Ideengeschichte, there are a couple of different conceptual frames or Denkfiguren, each of which interprets globalization a bit differently, like European expansion, for example, or circulation, or hybridization, or standardization, etc., etc. But what most of these concepts seem to have in common is that they implicitly suggest an overarching general direction of the historical process, a trend to more entanglement, transcultural entanglement, peaceful integration, shrinking distance between world regions, etc. And obviously in this regard, we are thoroughly disillusioned today. What we are experiencing instead is disintegration, nationalist isolationism, and the decline of global rules, etc., etc. So recently, a couple of prominent global historians, among them again, Jürgen Osterhammer, asked for taking a step back and asked for rethinking global history, its implicit theoretical assumptions and political premises. Could it be, they asked, that global historians just replaced one historical telos, civilization, for example, by another, entanglement? How global actually is what we call global history? Should we rather speak of global histories in the plural? And what does that mean in terms of historical methodology and narrative strategies? How to handle the relationship between micro and macro perspective, between the global and the local, etc., etc. Rethinking global history also means rethinking very general problems of history, its structure, its supposed direction, its relation to our own present. And it also means rethinking the historian's scholarly practices, the ways we perceive, explain, and narrate historical phenomena. These are just some of the general aspects of the topic tonight. But of course, I don't want to preempt the experts' discussion. We are delighted to have a panel of 4 distinguished global historians tonight. 2 of them are current fellows at the Wissenschaftskolleg and 2 external guests. I would like to very briefly introduce all the 4 of them. I'll start with Valeska Huber with a red t-shirt, professor of contemporary history at the University of Vienna and our current fellow here at the WICO. Previous stations of her career were Cambridge and Constance, where she received her PhD, then Harvard, London, the LSE and the German Historical Institute, and the Freie Universität Berlin, where she led a research group on communication and global orders. She was awarded, among others, the highly renowned Meyer-Leibniz Prize by the German Science Foundation, and she's a member of the Young Academy of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy. In her work, she has been thematizing various aspects of globalization, such as internationalism, migration, colonial, post-colonial social planning, global health and disease control, but also linguistic limits of globalization. And I only mention her book on the significance of the Suez Canal for global mobility. Currently here in the VICO, she is working on 20th century attempts to promote universal literacy. Ronald C. Poe, on the right, a Hong Kong and British citizen, is Associate Professor of International History at the London School of Economics, and also a current VICO Fellow. He received his PhD in Heidelberg and taught at the universities of Chicago and McGill, Montreal, before he moved to the LSE, where he teaches Chinese history. His research focus is on the maritime history of China from the 14th to the early 20th century. He has published extensively both in English and Chinese on the ocean as the blue frontier in late imperial China, its significance for trade and politics, as well as for the Chinese collective consciousness. Contrary to the common view, he claims that Qing China was not a mere land power that failed to engage with its maritime potential, but that Chinese attitudes towards the sea vacillated sharply over time. At the VICO, he works on the cultural history of shark fishing and shark fins as a luxury commodity, not only in imperial China, but still to the present day, which is endangering the species of going extinct. So cultural history of Qing China meets contemporary environmental history in his project. Now, global entanglement has not just started with Christopher Columbus, and this is why we also invited a distinguished medievalist, Dorothea Welteke. She is professor of medieval history at the Humboldt University. She started her career at the FU, where her dissertation was awarded the Ernst Reuter Prize, and further stations were Bielefeld, Göttingen, Konstanz, Frankfurt am Main, before she eventually returned to Berlin in 2021. Her primary research field is the complex entanglement of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic cultures in what we used to call the Middle Ages, but also the history of a phenomenon that had almost completely been ignored before, namely atheism and disbelief since the 12th century CE. Dorothea is also one of the very rare German experts of the Aramaic language and the Syrian churches. She recently published a monograph titled Die drei Ringe, the Three Rings, according to the famous fable in Lessing's Nathan, a stunningly learned but also very readable book of about 1,000 pages or so. And in this book, she writes what she calls Afro-Eurasische Geschichte, so Afro-European Asian history. It is a book on Jewish, Christian, and Muslim entanglement, but also conflict, exchange, mutual interpretations and misinterpretations, and so on cult practices, knowledge, belief systems, and so on from the 8th to the 15th centuries CE. In this book, she makes very clear why our modern concept of religion, as well as the concept of the Christian Occident, are completely misleading when we talk about these centuries. I just read the book and I can really recommend it enthusiastically. Marcia Schenk, on the right, is professor of global history. This is the name of the chair, the title of the chair, Global History at Potsdam University, with a particular focus on African studies. She graduated from Oxford, received her PhD from Princeton University, with a dissertation on Angolan and Mozambican migrant workers in the German Democratic Republic. She gained research experience in various sub-Saharan countries such as South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, and Botswana. And she held postdoc positions at HU, FU, and Princeton before she became full professor in Potsdam in 2020. Only to leave Potsdam again temporarily for fellowships in München and in Canada. She is interested in processes of migration, education and labor, history, international organizations, as well as the history of illegitimate military violence. Currently, she is writing a book on African refugee management in the era of decolonization in order to better understand the evolution of the present global refugee regime. A topic that couldn't be more timely, obviously. So thank you once again for accepting our invitation. Thank you for your willingness to moderate the discussion tonight. We are very much looking forward, and it is your turn.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these generous words of introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out in such amazing numbers on the first day of the semester. We are here tonight to think about the future of global history, nothing more, nothing less. And I will start with a very easy question. Let's see. So, Valeska, can I start with you? Are you a global historian?
I would answer with an emphatic yes, actually. I think, of the generation who was interested in things global really early on. When I started my studies, maybe not so much at the very beginning, I also studied histories of empire and colonialism. But then in my master's program, yes, I was interested in global history. But for me, actually, already then, it did not mean connections, interactions, integration, as Barbara has just outlined. But I was from the outside interested in those things that were more complicated about the global. My first interests were about contagion, disease, microhistories of quarantine stations, so this sounds quite familiar. So as a short answer, yes, global history, but never only with an interest in integration, connection, and flows.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And maybe I should say one more thing, and that might be something that connects with others in the room, that then I thought of a region where I could study this, and there were other reasons why I was drawn to it, but I also became a historian of the Middle East. So I think many global historians are both interested in things global, but are also experts of a specific part of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe we'll go later a little bit into this tension between area studies and global history as well. So yeah, can I ask you, Dorothea, are you a global historian?
Probably not. There are esteemed colleagues here like Thomas Ertel from FU who certainly would perhaps claim this title for himself with a lot of reason and maybe also more willingly than I do. What I like to be and what I like to do is be a historian of the world before European hegemony, for example. I like to be a historian that looks from outside into maybe the European world. I like to deconstruct medievalist and orientalist perspectives and narratives. And so this all makes me being interested in global perspectives, because this is one part of, I think, that global approaches can help. As a medievalist, it's very easy to decentralize, because in the Middle Ages, our European fields are not in the center, and this is something I find very interesting and very helpful to gain a new perspective and to criticize our narratives, and especially our theological narratives into modernity. So I'm interested also in ruptures, I'm interested in post-imperialistic histories, in environmental catastrophes, where people have after the imperial devastations, for example, in the 6th, 7th century, when all the forests are gone in the Middle East, to find new ways. So these are interesting things: ruptures, perspectives from outside, and deconstruction.
And Ron, what's your perspective?
Yeah, well, thanks for this. But let me just first briefly apologize in advance because I'm still recovering from a cold. So there might be some occasional cough. So and I have to speak slowly. And so, but I can reassure you that it's not contagious, so don't worry about it. But please bear with me. So back to the questions. I would also say yes, but with some hesitations, just like our previously distinguished speakers. I mean, because I don't think of myself as someone who covers the globe. Because there is often an assumption. I mean, especially among my students, at least, they feel like global histories means covering everything, or attempting to tell the history of the world as a whole. So I see it rather differently here, because for me, it is about global history is about approaching historical questions through connections, as Barbara and Valeska has already mentioned it, comparisons, movements, and also disconnections. It's not just connections, but also disconnections, and across different regions. So much of my work is grounded in maritime China, as Barbara kindly introduced me. And for example, but the questions I ask is not just about China. It's about order. It's about circulations, it's about power. So they're not just simply confined to a single region. So in that sense, I would describe myself less a global historian in terms of scope, but more in terms of methods or methodologies. And so global history to me is really a way of framing problems rather than a claim to comprehensiveness. I mean, if I could put it that way. I'm speaking very slowly, so I usually speak faster. Well, I hope you got it. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So as we can see already by these answers, that it's not a very easily definable topic. And we've certainly moved in the last couple of years towards not just an emphasis on connections, towards ruptures as well. Since we're thinking about where global history is going, I think it also behooves us to ask, where does it come from? And so if I might address you, Ron, again, would you like to tell us a little bit about the different genesis, perhaps, of global history? So thinking about world history, thinking about universal history, but also thinking about globalization studies.
Yeah, of course. I think this is a really important question, because I think quite a lot of confusions around global histories comes from how we narrate its origins. That is also from the assumption that it also has a single origin. It also has one single origins of global histories. But I think global history is often traced back to universal history, or what we call world histories, or more recently, to globalization studies. But I just want to highlight that these different kinds of frameworks, they are not the same tradition, and because universal histories, at least to me, but please disagree with me. But universal history had a philosophical ambitions to me that is trying to say something about humanities as a whole, and while globalization studies, as you just mentioned briefly, globalization studies, especially from the 1980s onwards, what I see and observe is that it had a more explicitly political and economic focus here. So that's why we often center on integrations, on markets and flows, and these various connections. So global histories, draws on both, I would say, both trends, which is globalization studies and universal histories. But it is not reducible to it, to either of them, because if I would also say that origins is very hard to identify here, and there's also some problems if we try not to identify the origins here, or pay too much attention to identify the origins of global history here, because the problem would be, we will end up assuming that the stories of increasing integrations as something like a default, because if we try to really trace that kind of origins, and for example, if we try to take the history of maritime Asia as an example, well, we can see extensive long-distance connections, tributary missions where China was the center, or we can see commercial networks, and we can also see migrations across the South China Sea and beyond. But these kind of interactions, they do not form a single integrated systems within the Chinese kind of like political and cultural framework. So they are uneven. They are often like seasonal, shaped by not just political like kind of discourses or narratives, but also by ecological concerns, like monsoon patterns, like the wind patterns, like there are various kinds of maritime matters. So, and also mediated through different types of local practices and regional circuits. So I would say rather than pointing to one trajectory or one particular origins, I mean, so these examples just, for example, I'm sure we can find other examples in the European context, but in just based on the maritime Asians examples, they suggested something more plural. So that's why, I mean, I really find it helpful to think less in terms of a single global history and more in terms of, as Barbara mentioned earlier, global histories. I mean, there's a plural forms in it. And because there are different ways of connections, I mean, across space, I mean, that has been organized, experienced, and understood in different contexts. And speaking of which, I mean, actually, David Motterdale, a former WICO fellow here, and also Richard Drayton, I mean, they have published an article titled The Futures of Global Histories in the Journal of Global Histories last year. So I think they actually provide me some really promising directions. I mean, that prompted us to think about, I mean, the pluralities of global histories. So if there are plural forms, so it's very hard to have a particular or single origins. That's how I would put it.
Thank you so much. And I think we can already see that it's a complex origin in terms of the philosophy of history behind that. Would it be easier perhaps to ask this question in terms of time? Are there some sort of temporal prioritizations or temporal origins to global history, Dorothea?
I think that's difficult because then not everybody or all periods are part of the debate. And talking from my perspective, I would certainly think I would like to maybe start from where you ended, that the tradition of universal history, I think, was important for developing global Middle Ages because it brought into contact different sorts of cultures, started to compare, started to think about common narrative perhaps or models, which are still important. And on the other hand, we have something like, for example, religious studies, which is always global and which doesn't have any of our periodization, is not interested in that at all. And this is a field where I've been working on during the last years, and I was invited to this World Conference of Religious Studies where all these things that we are talking about, narratives, European, non-European, period, before modern and modern, do not play a role at all. And everybody is going everywhere, so I thought. Certainly, again, there are specializations, but they are very different from what we have. And these also play into our perspectives of global history because people work on different subjects. The same may be true of the history of science, which is also for a long time thinking about interconnectedness, also for the time before the European hegemony. And we could go on with other subjects. So I couldn't tell. And I only could tell for certain projects. We can see that, for example, in England, the idea of the world system started to be interesting also for medievalists, introduced by a sociologist, namely Janet Abu-Lughod. Then we had the Oxford groups who were thinking about global Middle Ages, and that not being something universal, but rather, like you said, being differences, connections, ruptures, and a new method of trying to connect histories and also disconnect histories between the mountain and the plain, between the city and the desert, and all these differences, which then periodizations make much less sense. We talk about nomads at all. It's something maybe not so necessary to define a medievalist nomad and a medieval nomad and one of the 21st century. So it's difficult, and there are different sources, but they come back, I think, to the same result. So history becomes more difficult. And we have more than one position from which to tell history than we had before, maybe.
I think we've already started to think about what global history actually is, the impossible question, right? So is it a method? Is it a scale? Is it perspective? Valeska, what would you say? How would you define global history? What is it for you?
For me, it's both, it's mainly a perspective, or maybe the idea that's most central for me is to look at a single issue or a single topic, a single place from a multiplicity of perspectives. So I would completely agree with Ron when people tell me, oh, you're a global historian, you know something about everywhere. I say no, but I do claim that the specific thing about global history, which it might also share with some other approaches, is the attempt to look at a single issue from many different perspectives. They can be scalar, so this comes now to the question about methods. I think early global histories very often used the idea of scales, looking at something from a global scale up there, up to the micro scale. It could be, in the case of my earlier interests in disease, even the scale of the microbes, but the individual scale. So this idea of scaling up and down was one of the methods that global historians used to make their topic manageable. I think in the recent past, many have been drawn to the idea of microhistory. Which is also a little bit counterintuitive if you think about global history as the history of the globe. And I must say the early histories were very often these more large scale, large tomes covering as many continents and places as possible. But I think more recently, most global historians have taken a more modest approach, thinking, for instance, about an individual biography or an individual place and how it can only be understood if we change perspectives. And I think for me, really, this idea of changing perspectives is what's drawn me to the field and what I also think is really fundamental, that we don't look at history of any place, any nation, just from one side, and that we attempt to actually try to change how would it look like from the perspective of a different individual, from a different place. So I think this, for me, is the main contribution of global history.
If I may add, I would emphatically agree and say that we have some opportunities to do this also with the world before the European hegemony. For example, with studies like from Verena Krebs, who is now working in Bochum, telling a history maybe of Europe, but from the perspective of Ethiopia, and Ethiopia not anymore the one that is on the margin, what kind of margin of whatever, but as the center of a new story, which helps us to put our world in new perspective. So she wouldn't cover the global medieval world, which whatever would that be, but she's changing perspectives and giving us a new way of thinking about a particular place in a global world.
Yeah, and that's, I think, where we've also moved beyond decentering or provincializing Europe, paradigms that were very important for global history, but I would hope that we've moved one step ahead and think about multi-perspective narratives, plural narratives that don't even have to use the term of center so much anymore.
I just want to echo with what we just said. It's like, just sum up, is that I also agree that scales is important, but it's just part of global history, and it's not sufficient. I mean, you can write at a large scale without doing global history, I mean, in other words. And you can do global history through quite small and focused studies. I mean, just like what Valeska was saying. I mean, you can even focus on the disease, the disease. The cold, I can't even say bacteria. Okay, so I just want to sum up this. I mean, scales matter, but it's not sufficient. I mean, and it's more about the methods of it and the way how we see it.
So we can also say global history has proliferated a lot in the last 20 years or so. So if we think about the Journal of Global History, it was founded in 2006. Would you say that this proliferation of global history sort of speaks to the fact that it's an intellectually really vibrant approach, or is it conceptually really diffused? Would you like to take this, Ron?
Surely, of course. I think probably both. I think like the expansion of the field somehow reflects the genuine intellectual energy here. But it also means that the term global history is now used in quite different ways. Yeah. Because as we already talked about it earlier, there's no single origins of it, and there's no single definitions of it. So that means, I mean, it seems like it's universally applicable, I mean, in various kind of studies. So that means when people can seems like to use it as a tool to identify, to look at or to examine, I mean, various kind of issues. So this is not necessarily a problem though. I mean, although it seems like it's quite sketchy or a little bit murky, or hard to define, but it does mean that we need to be clearer about what we are doing, and when we use the term global history. I think that is the very important point that we have to think about. I mean, otherwise, I mean, it simply would become a label rather than a method. So I think that might be one of the dangers. I mean, to sort of identify this kind of like ideas and expansions or diffusions.
Right, but I mean, I would disagree slightly whether we need to define a field, actually draw boundaries, say this is our territory and this not. I mean, I agree there should be some clarity, and I'm on the board of this journal, so I actually think about what's in there and what's out, and I think there are some clear ideas about how research in multiple languages is preferred, so not just English sources, but sources is in many languages, research that covers different archives, that also covers more than one region. So there are some benchmarks, I would say, what counts as global history, but I don't know, I'm less territorial, I think, in the way that I think we should actually create a field that has clear demarcations. I'm more interested in the idea of a perspective or multiple perspectives that Marcia mentioned, where actually it's not a contradiction to do global history and gender history, for instance. I mean, it might be most fruitful when approaches are combined, and I think we would all agree. But the question, I mean, I think there should be a minimal definition, or maybe something that we strive for in terms of how we do research and how we expand and combine perspectives, but it doesn't need to be very limited. I mean, it should be plural.
Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we need to draw the boundaries here or confine itself, but what I would say is that at least clear some kind of definitions or some key points there, I mean, to identify it. I mean, otherwise, I mean, why do we need to use such a term? Because it does remind me of an article is saying, it is entitled Maritime History as Global History. Because there has been an era that maritime history is in grave danger, because people feel like maritime history is just about connections, it's about global history. I mean, it's just part of global history. So why do we need such a term to define maritime history? So I feel like global history or different kinds of histories, I mean, might also experience or might have encountered these sorts of challenges or problems that we at least need to think about it.
So what would be some of the benchmarks that you would be proposing then for
I would propose global histories. Plural forms. I mean, like that's, of course, it's hard. It's very it's not an easy task, I would say. But at least, I mean, some sort. For example, if we try to look at the manifesto, for example, of the two flagships journals in the field of global history. One is called Journal of Global Histories, and the other one is just Journal of World Histories. I mean, their definitions, I mean, it seems like it's a broadly covering, I mean, everything. But, I mean, they also have certain methodologies, I mean, highlighted and spotlighted there. And I think these kind of, like, indications matter. And that would help define the field, I mean, and in order to progress, I mean, better way and a more effective way. That's how I see it, but of course, I mean, people might disagree.
Dorette, you'd like to come in here?
Yeah, to ask you two or you three, if that would be then the difference between global histories and universal history, which tends to be in the singular, or world history. Would you think what's your relation to world and universal history in comparison to global? And you also, well, I really would be interested, because these debates are, I think, more, I'd say, controversial in more recent or modern histories than there are in the Middle Ages.
I mean, for me, I think the main interest or the main contrast is less between universal history, world history, and global history. In fact, I've never been so interested in these kind of smaller debates. But for me, the main contrast is still between national histories and then others that take different frameworks. I mean, they can also be regional, maritime. We can think of different spatial configurations, but I think the dialogue or sometimes conflict is still between national histories, national paradigms, where very often people study actually their own nation. I mean, there's nothing per se wrong with this. I mean, I also don't go out as a kind of missionary and say every historian should do what I do, but I think it is an important complementary perspective to just thinking about your own nation in the boundaries maybe that we have in this moment in time and say this is the history that I look at. And I feel like, so for me, this is the most productive, complicated dialogue. And it doesn't need to be an opposition necessarily. I mean, I've just come back from Georgia and the Caucasus yesterday, where I had a really interesting workshop with people working on their national histories of Georgia, Armenia, and actually thought about how this can be a dialogue, and that's what I find most productive. So it's not that I think every historian should forget about their own nation, but just to think about how could we change perspectives and how would it look like from a different angle.
That's very interesting for the medievalist, because this contrast between national history and global history is not existent in medieval studies, because national history, correct me, still national history is important, but that's not been the interesting focus or the focus of research in the last 20, 30 years. It's not national history, it's European history perhaps, comparative history, but not so much the national. Maybe it's coming back now, I'm not sure.
So in my assessment, I would still insist on saying that it would be more effective to argue that global history is a method. It's really a method. I mean, if we really want to sort of define the field or to set up some kind of boundaries, I mean, it is a kind of methods. I mean, that helps us to study those connection, disconnection, and something. And it might actually lead to the other questions. It's like, how global is global history, isn't it? Because to be honest, it's not entirely global, right? It's not entirely global, based on what we have just discussed. And practically speaking, I mean, to me, I mean, if we try to look at the historiographies, I mean, it is also still shaped by Anglophone scholarships and by particular institutional centers or like WICO or like other like important research centers or by uneven access to archives as well. So as long as we can't really get these all sorted, it might not be easy to really comes to the definitions or to the ultimate objectives of global histories in a sense. So it's still in progress in a way. So that's why it has a future.
I think this is a really important point that you just raised, the point that even something like global history has a very distinct geography, right? And that geography is currently, if we look at research outputs, situated very much in the global north and also to a large extent in the Anglophone world. And if we want to live up to changing perspective, incorporating multiple languages, going to archives, incorporating archives really from around the world, working with primary sources, et cetera, then as Ron said, there's actually quite a lot of work to do. And I'd be interested in what kind of work should we be doing? I mean, how do we perhaps structurally address this structural imbalance and asymmetry that we're actually trying in the histories that we're writing to overcome, and yet it is still very much in the research practice that we find ourselves in.
Well, if I may, I just want to clarify that. I'm not suggesting that there's a simple contrast between East Asia or the extra-European worlds and the European worlds. I mean, early modern European worlds were also characterized by various kinds of differences, right? And then I was saying, yes, they have been dominating the field, but there are also studies in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, in China. I mean, they have been actually moving towards the directions of situating these extra-European worlds within a global context here. So, but to me, I think the difference between these Anglophone or European-based scholarship and the Asian-based scholarship would be lies more in how the connections, if we still believe that global history is related very closely with connections. It lies more in how these connections were conceptualized and organized. And again, I mean, by default, because of my Chinese background, and so in the Chinese case, for example, like I would say long-distance interactions, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, is often understood through a combination of regional networks, administrative practices, and shifting notions of orders about center and periphery and something like that. And that did not necessarily prioritize integrations as such, but what we see here are connections that are sustained, but also partial and layered, and sometimes deliberately limited. So the point here is that these regions. I'm not saying that, for example, like Europe or the Anglophone scholarships, they are more global, whereas regions beyond it is less global. But that they reflect the different ways of approaching what we might be calling global, if I'm making myself articulate well. And so that I think that is also the challenge of global histories. I mean to sort of like try to identify, these kind of differences. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if we're trying to perhaps also address a kind of material aspect to all of this, so I'm thinking about global history on the African continent has not really become a big thing. And one of the reasons lies in research funding, right? It's expensive to be doing global history, to be traveling to archives all over the place. And so it's not really something that's open to everyone, so to speak. Is there something that we can address there when we're sitting here thinking about, what does it mean to write global history from where we are, from the research environments in which we are embedded? What else might we be thinking about in terms of, is it the answer to do more collaborative research, or is it the answer to have more fellowships? I mean, what are some of the things that we could be envisioning in order to really come closer to this idea of global history as written around the globe? Not necessarily, as Ron was saying, with perhaps one idea of what it is, but to give everybody the chance to join into the discussion of what we think it might be.
No, I think that you are absolutely right to point to these inequalities, asymmetries. I mean, the assumption that everyone wants to do global history might be slightly problematic, because I've encountered many people in the Middle East and elsewhere who've also thought we want to write our national histories. Someone else has been writing our histories for a long time in colonial contexts, and it's about time that we write our own national histories. So it's not as if everyone around the world wants to join this project. So there again, I would emphasize the idea, I think, of dialogue, talking to each other rather than exclusive approaches, historical approaches that kind of are in opposition. But that being said, I think a lot about collaborative history. It's not something that I've practiced, and we're trained very much, I think, as historians in the idea that we write single author monographs, and it's a change, I think, for many of us to work collaboratively, but I'm starting a new project, as Barbara has mentioned, on multilingualism in different colonial and post-colonial contexts, and there I absolutely want and have to collaborate, because my linguistic capacities are limited. I'm very interested in different imperial borderlands, and how multilingualism is negotiated there. And this I can only see as a collaborative project.
I would also think that this would be vital, and there can be two levels perhaps. That the exchange and the connections between different area and regional studies where we work which is very difficult in the German system, as we've been talking about, because it's not been really organized. Historical departments are the historical departments, and Chinese departments or institutes for African, Asian studies have their own departments. We are not connected. It's very difficult to really talk to each other, and especially, I think, in my field. It's been done, but it could be more, and it could be, and I think it's vital, it's necessary. And the second one is to talk to people who are writing histories, global histories in India, for example. That 2-3 years ago we had a seminary on going beyond medievalist and orientalist narratives, what do? We talk to the historians who do medieval maritime history of the Indian Ocean and try to have an exchange and really talk, what are your sources, how do your sources look like? Copper plates, oh, what are copper plates? And really start to get to interact with different perspectives and their perspective on the European pepper hunger, for example. And I find this very fruitful, and this is something that was very important for the Oxford working group on the global Middle Ages, that we have a dialogical perspective on global history. And it remains like that. It doesn't get one center in the end, but it remains dialogical, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with all these points. But I also think that we need to be realistic here, because large-scale structural changes like funding system, like all the authorship models, might be difficult. So, but there are clearly, some immediate steps. There's some of them already covered by Valeska so, for example, more multilingual scholarships, more collaborative work, and also better integrations of different archives. I think archives also matters because we're historians, and also perhaps more openness. To, I completely agree with Valeska. Co-authored. Who offer research across different regions, and here that reminds me of the International Institute of Asian Studies at Leiden universities. They have been promoting a new kind of schemes by connecting institutions in the global south. You talk with each other. So that is the South-South connections within the global south. Because the way that we term global south, it seems like we want to actually bring them into the dialogues of the global north. But I think the approach, of simply grouping the global south as a particular distinct camps there, might also be useful. And so some kinds of these kind of collaborations, we might not necessarily be, we have to involve them, but we actually could provide them the space and the resources to work on their kind of global history. So that's how I would say that these kind of moderate immediate steps might work. And so of course they're not transformative on their own, but they can gradually reshape the field and also answer the questions that I just struggled to answer. Yep.
Yeah, it also seems to me that global history is pretty uniquely placed to embrace more collaborative forms of research. Speaking about which, you mentioned the global south. Actually, I would say that the trajectory of global history has been very much influenced by ideas, say, from dependency theory, world systems theory. More recently, now we also can think about the relationship between global history and post-colonial studies. So in that way, there's always been a sort of productive friction between theories coming from, say, sociology being taken up by global historians and thought through. So if we stay with post-colonial studies for a little bit, what would you say is the relationship between a very politicized topic, right? At this point, post-colonial studies has been extremely politicized outside of the academy. Even within, I would say it's a plethora of voices. It's not necessarily a monolithical thing. But is it useful to think with post-colonial studies? Do you have examples of where that has been done in global history output? Dorothea.
About the present, I'm ambivalent, and maybe there are for the Middle Ages, and I'm interested to, or I'm looking forward to our discussion. Perhaps I'd like to go back in this case and remind us of our works on post-colonial Middle Ages that are 25 years old or about 30 years old, and which I think gave important perspectives of kind of breaking up our medievalist narratives. That helped a lot, I think. And there was very sound science, very sound scholarship that rethought medievalism and Orientalist narratives, thinking them in the frame of post-colonial theory. I found that very, liberating, I might say. Yeah, I might say that. But today I'm maybe more hesitant and the more recent developments, perhaps.
Would you like to agree or disagree?
Agree, of course. Of course. I mean, yeah, so post-colonial, right? I mean, we're still talking about that. I think, well, I would see them as complementary, but not exactly identical in a way, because, again, global history has been very good at tracing connections, as we already mentioned, and disconnections. But of course, I mean, the origins of, not origins, but starting from the 1980s, I mean, we really focus on that kind of markers and integrations and connections. But post-colonial and decolonial approaches, but correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a post-colonial historian, but I feel like these approaches reminds us to ask who defines those connections and from where. So I think that is a key reason. I mean, so again, in East Asian context, there are long-standing ways. I mean, of thinking about like orders. I mean, I've been making use of Chinese examples earlier, but in Japan, it's the same stuff happened right there about order, center, periphery, and also in Joseon, Korea. So these are all the relevant examples. I mean, that could tell us that. That kind of management, when it comes to these kind of interactions, I mean, do not always map squarely onto the Europeans' categories. So bringing those into conversations, I mean, that is post-colonial studies and so forth. I mean, I would say it's less about addressing or adding new cases or case studies, but more about widening the conceptual vocabularies of the field. So I would put it that way.
I mean, I would also see much less of an opposition than might be currently sometimes in overheated discourses put. I mean, I would agree with your point about a very diverse field of post-colonial studies and also a very diverse field of global histories. And of course, there might be a contrast between macro global histories and certain post-colonial studies concepts. But for me, I mean, the interesting thing about global history, that might run counter to Ron's idea of defining and naming clear benchmarks. For me, the eclectic part of global history has always been the attractive one. So coming back to my early comment about a multiplicity of perspectives, I looked at the space of the Suez Canal and really tried to see how it looks like from the perspective of a tourist taking the first early Kodak pictures, to troops transported through it, to prostitutes, stowaways, coal heavers. And so this is really, I mean, I was more interested in the stories, the histories that I could reveal through a multiplicity of perspectives rather than having a very rigid canon of theory to draw on. And Ron, I also want to come back to that point of connections. I actually think that we've overused this term, and for me, from the outset, I thought of the global as something that cannot be about connections. I know that it's been the way the field has been perceived, and it's also been the key vocabulary, maybe connection, integration, flows. But I think for me, the interesting part about the global has always been the idea of the power relations, inequalities, complications. And coming back to your point about the future of global history, what do we need? I mean, I agree collaboration, but I also think we need to rethink our concepts in ways where I don't necessarily have an answer yet, because we are still stuck in these binaries, dichotomies. So people who don't like connections, and what they come up with is disconnections. People don't like integration, they come up with, they use disintegration, equality, inequality. And what I would like to see, and have not worked out myself, is what could be a vocabulary that we could use to exactly name what I've been saying. I mean, how the global is always both, I mean, and how they are connected. Renate Dürr, who's also a fellow of our year here at the WICO, uses the term of proximities. There has been the idea of contact zones. And all these concepts, I think, have their problems, but I think this is really where global history should also go. That being said, I mean, I don't think we should get stuck too much, as in the past decades, in these very conceptual, just kind of where's the limit of where's global history, where's transnational history. We should then also be able to show how this can be done. And that's, of course, the challenge, right? We like to talk about multiple perspectives, complicated narratives, but the complicated thing is how to do it.
I think I'm sensing a general agreement that it's not so much about necessarily defining what global history is, but sort of opening up different ways of viewing. And yet I'm interested in understanding a little bit better, because several of you are positioning yourselves also as people who have consciously really invested in learning about a specific area of the globe, right? So area studies and global histories. Is this something that causes friction, or do we all need to be area studies specialists in order to approach global history?
I actually think we have to. I think there's no way around it. We need to have areas where we feel more comfortable, and better more than one. I think that's given. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that we cannot, as we had perhaps before, or that is one of the criticism often made. Can you talk about X, Y, Z, where you have not done, where you're not entirely sure about the philology, or where you haven't done any basic studies? And I think that's wrong. Yeah. That we can also connect these studies and have these, integrate them in dialogue, but also coming up with new levels in the way that we do integrate them.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that grounding is important. I mean, Fred Cooper, a long time past fellow here as well, said you have to know something about somewhere, and I think that's quite true still, as a critic of some global history approaches. But I would also say that you need to be able to have a certain maybe dilettantism, that you can also talk about different regions, enter into dialogue, say, well, these are my limitations, but I do think it's important to understand how it would look from here. So I think my plea would be a more modest global history, but also an ambitious one. And how we kind of balance these two, ambition and modesty, is what I think at least I'm striving for.
Same here. I mean, I also realize the importance of area studies here. So for me, area studies really provide the depth, including namely linguistic, archival, and contextual depth. I mean, that global history depends on. Because, I mean, without such a grounding, I think global history might just become superficial, and especially given taken what we just talked about here. There's no single origins, no pluralities here, and so we definitely need to rely on area studies. So the two should really be working together. So I agree totally.
Lots of agreement here. So I want to move us into sort of the third and perhaps last phase of this discussion, which is explicitly thinking about the challenges of the future and how global history as a discipline might respond to that. Two things that come to mind is, of course, the environment and the current political climate in which we live. Maybe we can start with the environment. There's several ways in which I think, for instance, the discussions about the Anthropocene, but also Chakrabarty's discussion about the planetary might pose significant challenges to being able to tell global histories that have humans as their actors at their center. How would you respond to this challenge to rethink global history in response to the climate changes that we live through and the thinking that goes on around those themes? Dorothea?
Yes, please.
I don't want to do what medievalists tend to do. There had been climate change before. No, but this is something that certainly could be an approach where we can talk about fruitfully together as global historians. Think about climate change, think about the way people interact with their environment, think about how they exploit them, what kind of traditions are there of exploiting the environment, digging up everything, and other cultures who don't, for example. So, and the interconnectedness here is, even in the Middle Ages, something global, because the warming weather in the 13th century helped the the European economies to grow much more grain, and it also dried out the deserts in Arabia, and it ended the culture of the Anasazi in America because of the heat. So there are certainly connectednesses that we could talk about very fruitfully for climate and environmental history, and I think it's been done. It's a very fruitful and growing field in global Middle Ages history.
Ron, you also wanted to comment on this point.
No, are we talking about environmental changes or the political climate? Are we, just to clarify it?
Please go in and develop this further to the political aspect.
Well, I just want to echo with what has been discussed, the environmental side of it is, it's also quite global. I mean, let me also give you an example that within the Chinese context, when it comes to environmental histories, I'm sure there are experts sitting in here that will correct me if I'm wrong, because there's always a Chinese saying that the Chinese, they embrace the nature. Whereas, the Westerners, they were more adventurous. They have more entanglements, with the natures. So that is our sort of kind of conceptions. But actually we are under the impression that, that's the case, but in actuality, it isn't. Because the Chinese also destroyed, the nature, especially since the early modern era, because of the population booms and so forth, and so lots of, and the Chinese didn't really have enough food, because of the soil deteriorations, because of all this kind of overfishing and so forth. So these problems also matter if we try to situate the non-European worlds, within the global setting here. So that's my response to the environmental climate changes, that also affect, East Asia. But if we want to move on to the political climate, I think it certainly it complicates global history, but I wouldn't say it undermines it, because if anything, it actually makes the questions more urgent. Because the current political climate, it seems like we are having different kinds of national narratives arise. Are we talking about this, right? I'm not going too far, isn't it?
Going a little bit far.
Okay, but
because
so
we're currently still thinking about planetary and whether that kind of hits the end of the toolbox of our global historian.
So
whether we need to maybe think you'll get there. That will be the next question.
I should stop because I just want to clarify. That's why, whether it's political climate or the climate change. But I'll stop here.
All right, so any thoughts on how we write history if the human is no longer in the center, because this is a question of microbes and long planetary timeframes in which our human existence is but a speck? Is that the end? Can we write that in global history? Are we interested in engaging with that in global history, or is this kind of outside of the frame of global history?
I think we're interested. It depends. People are interested in many different things, and I'm interested in one thing in one project and then doing something else in another. I think that question of method is really interesting, and archives, and how we can find the sources, how we can expand our toolbox, so to speak. And I think it's something we should all constantly do to rethink our toolbox. I definitely had very different methods from my early work to what I do now. And I have many questions when I discuss with students who want to work on either climate or animal histories, or kind of decenter the human, what kind of sources and archives they want to use. As a project, I think the research questions are very clear, and maybe they are not just global history questions, but I think they are very clear and very important. I think the methods and archives, the conventional way of how we work, are less worked out yet.
Yeah.
Dorothea.
And there's also a problem of the organization of science. May I say that? In Berlin 2026, when we struggle to conserve our historical departments, when we lose chairs, and that is particularly pertinent for the medieval global Middle Ages, but also I think for other periods, that when we have only very few chairs left, and we still see it as a luxury to have this kind of studies.
I think that moves on to the
that
question
moves
of
on
politics,
also to
which I think
politics,
is very important.
Yes.
and what is really important about history, and what our students have to learn, and what do they have to teach to the pupils. Then we move into a phase where the hard political realities that we have to face.
Absolutely. So that's the question that Ron has been asking for and waiting for, which is about...
Don't get it wrong. I just heard it wrongly, sorry.
Which is about the fact that we are living through changed political times. We're seeing a resurgence of strongman politics, certainly of nationalism. So a lot of the things that global history used to write against. So I would say that there was always a political project within the discipline of global history, which might have been a little bit implicit, but it was one of educating global citizens. And that is certainly a project that we might have to rethink, or do we? Valeska.
I mean, I think that term of global citizens for me has a little bit of a strange resonance. It's not really so much my agenda that I mean, I think I have a modest agenda about the kind of changing perspectives that I started with. But where I agree is that we live in a time where school books are rewritten in many places in the world, where national narratives are becoming really strong again, and connected with what Dorothea said about funding cuts in the humanities. There is really a danger that we lose that kind of breadth of expertise and perspectives again. And I find it interesting, this moment. I mean, I don't agree with the idea that global history is born in a moment of globalization and is only interested in connections. I hope I made clear that I was always interested in the questions of boundary drawing, friction, how a space like the Suez Canal could be both a global connection around 1900, but also a boundary, a place of slowdown. So I think the debates are not so much about globalization versus nationalism, something that's kind of soft and interconnected and nice, versus like a world of strongmen and nationalism. But I think what we could lose is really the openness of a strong claim that I would make here again, that we can only understand history if we see it from different places. And there I'm worried about a kind of a re-nationalization of curricula, of school books and so forth.
But I think, on the other hand, I think like the resurgence of these kind of national narratives, I mean, also actually reminds us of that global connections, I mean, have always been negotiated, as you said. I mean, it has always been contested, and sometimes we resist. So that actually is making global histories, I mean, more urgent in a way. I mean, instead of like being diffused. So global history to me still can be valuable. I mean, under these kind of pressures of political climates, but perhaps it needs to be a little bit more modest in a way that it's less about overarching synthesis and more about clarifying how different forms of I don't want to use connections again, but connections and disconnections or asymmetries, whatever, and how these kind of like different kinds of interactions have operated. So it reminds us in that way.
So I would like to challenge all of us to think about something that I know as historians we're not really educated or trained to think about the future, predicting the future, but if you had to choose one particular challenge that you think global history will have to address in the next 10 years, what would that be?
For the global Middle Ages and the German-speaking countries, survive.
For me, I mean, the question of collaboration we've discussed, and it's not always easy to collaborate in changing political climates and places where academic freedom might be limited. So the issue of collaboration, I think, is very important. The other issue that I'm thinking about a lot is archives. It's a little bit boring and old-fashioned, maybe in the age of digitization and open access, to think about archives. But I do think, like, what we do most importantly is to to access sources that are difficult to find. And so what I would hope is that it continues to be a field that's really archivally based. And an interesting topic here would be to think about the digital AI and the actual physical archives in places where it's very difficult to get access and work. And I think that tension is something that will change in ways that we can maybe not foresee, but I would make a strong plea for actual work in physical archives and see what's accessible and still strive for it.
Yeah, Likewise. I think the key challenges also would be is linguistics and archival limits. And I think Valeska just raised a very, very important point, is that the AI thing is also matters here. So how is global history going to interact effectively with the AI technologies these days?
That would be the next panel.
That would be the next panel. For example, in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, I mean, we won't be sitting here, but the AI robots will be here by inserting the questions that you just asked them to analyze for us. So this is one way of interpreting that kind of AI age. But of course, I mean, how are we going to make use of these kind of AI technologies to fight against these, to address those challenges? Linguistic, archival would also be quite essential to me.
Thank you so much. Now, it's almost impossible, I would say, to summarize such a rich discussion, but I would try and perhaps just emphasize 3 points that we can continue thinking about, because it's not so much about giving definite answers of what global history is or isn't, but I think this is about raising questions foremost. And I think one of the themes that we've been talking about and that we actually started with is the identity and the question of, well, what is global history? And we've been reflecting on the fact that it has different methods, so comparison, entanglements, disentanglements, that it is also very much importantly a way of seeing something from different perspectives. So it is a perspective to approach the narrative of history, and that it is still somehow to do with scale, although it cannot be reduced to scale. And this is, I mean, we've heard a lot about microhistories, the importance of microhistories in global history more recently, perhaps also translocal histories, so telling the globe through a particular village, for instance. And that way, scale remains important, even if it's no longer perhaps what the earlier work of global historians was, like a macro scale analysis of here is how the world works. Then I think I would like to also draw our attention to this discussion that we had around geography. So that the geography of global history, where is it taking place, who is being read, who is being cited, why is that, who has access to which archives, et cetera, et cetera. So the very materiality that we sometimes think to overlook when we're very much thinking about the concepts that we're trying to engage with. And here I think we have to just note that it is still an unequal world in which we write and live, and it is by no means the same access to resources for everyone trying to think through a particular question. And thirdly, I think we can perhaps take these thoughts around the pressures that global history is facing with us. Pressures from a political sphere, so survival of institutions, of positions, as Dorothea mentioned, for instance. But also the pressure in terms of AI, for instance. What is that going to actually change? Is that going to replace us? You said, maybe there'll just be some robots sitting here in 20 years from now. So how do we deal with both the possibilities that I think are actually great for global history specifically? We can work with translations, we can access, without having to fly all over the place, different archives. So I think there are real chances also in AI, but how do we deal with that? And then lastly, this idea that we need to collaborate more and be open, and Ron mentioned shared history as a new concept, which I really liked and I'm going to look into. But this idea that we should kind of come out of our ivory tower and of our single authored books and really take collaboration more seriously in order to write a better form of global histories in the plural. So thank you so much for your attention and for coming out, and thank you for participating.